I need to tell someone about what happened in Millbrook Hollow. Not because I think anyone will believe me, but because the weight of keeping it inside is crushing what little sanity I have left. Every night I close my eyes and see that place again. The way the trees seemed to breathe. The way the silence felt thick enough to drown in. The way my friends looked at me in those final moments before everything went wrong. It started 3 months ago, though I suppose the real beginning goes back much further than that. My grandmother used to tell stories about places that existed between things, between day and night, between sleeping and waking, between the world we know and the world we pretend doesn't exist. She called them thin places, where the membrane separating realities grew gossamer fine and sometimes tore completely. I never believed her stories. I was 24, practical, grounded in the mundane realities of student loans and part-time jobs. But then Marcus found the old survey maps in his grandfather's attic, and everything changed. The maps were hand-drawn, dating back to the 1940s, showing property lines and geographical features that no longer appeared on modern charts. Most interesting was a large area marked simply as the Hollow, a circular depression in the forest about 15 miles north of our college town. What made it unusual wasn't just its absence from contemporary maps, but the notation scrawled in faded ink along the margin. Not to be developed. Recommend avoidance. Marcus was studying forestry and had a particular fascination with forgotten places. He'd spent the previous summer documenting abandoned settlements and ghost towns throughout the region, always searching for stories that had slipped through the cracks of recorded history. The mysterious hollow represented exactly the kind of puzzle that consumed him. Alex was the first to suggest we investigate. They were majoring in anthropology with a focus on folklore, and the idea of a place deliberately omitted from modern records sparked their academic curiosity. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, initially resisted the idea, but eventually agreed when Marcus pointed out that a weekend camping trip would give us all a much-needed break from finals preparation. I agreed because I was young and stupid and thought adventure meant driving to places that didn't appear on GPS. We left on a Friday afternoon in late October, when the autumn air carried that particular chill that promises winter's approach. The drive took us through increasingly rural countryside, past farms that seemed abandoned, and forests that grew thicker and darker with each passing mile. The last landmark of civilization was a gas station with a single working pump and a clerk who watched us with suspicious eyes as we loaded up on supplies. The road leading toward the hollow wasn't marked on any map, modern or otherwise. We found it only because Marcus had correlated the old survey coordinates with current topographical features, identifying a barely visible logging road that matched the general direction indicated on his grandfather's charts. The gravel path was overgrown with vegetation, forcing us to hike the final 3 miles through dense woodland that seemed to swallow sound. I remember the exact moment we first saw the hollow. We'd been walking for over an hour, following what might have been a deer trail, when the trees suddenly parted to reveal a circular clearing, roughly 200 yards across. The depression wasn't dramatic, maybe 20 feet deep at its center, but something about it immediately struck me as wrong. The trees surrounding the hollow were different from those we'd passed through. While the forest we'd hiked consisted mainly of oak and maple in full autumn color, The trees ringing the clearing were predominantly evergreens, their branches dark and bare of the lower limbs that should have been present. They formed an almost perfect circle, as if they'd been deliberately planted, though their size suggested they'd been growing for decades. More unsettling was the quality of light within the hollow. Despite the late afternoon sun shining brightly in the forest behind us, the clearing existed in a state of perpetual twilight. Not shadow exactly, but a dimness that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, as if the earth was absorbing illumination rather than reflecting it. Alex was the first to voice what we were all thinking. This place feels wrong. Sarah laughed, though the sound carried an edge of nervousness. It's just a dip in the ground, she said. Probably a sinkhole or something geological. But Marcus was already consulting his grandfather's notes, cross-referencing the survey details with what we observed. According to these measurements, he said, pointing to a series of numbers scrawled along the map's edge, this depression should be roughly 40 feet deep, not 20. Maybe the survey was wrong, I suggested, though even as I spoke the words, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. We set up camp on the rim of the hollow, far enough back that we couldn't see directly into the depression, but close enough to maintain visual contact with the strange clearing. As daylight faded, the temperature dropped rapidly, and we built a fire that struggled to provide warmth despite the abundance of dry wood. That first night passed without incident, though I slept poorly. My dreams were filled with sounds, not the usual forest noises of wind and small animals, but something else. A rhythmic creaking, like old floorboards settling, mixed with what might have been whispers in a language I couldn't identify. I woke several times convinced that someone was walking around our campsite, but each time I checked, my 3 companions were sleeping peacefully in their bags. Saturday morning brought low clouds that settled over the forest, like a gray blanket. The hollow, which had appeared unsettling in daylight, now looked actively malevolent. The perpetual twilight within the depression had deepened to something approaching dusk, despite the early hour. Alex suggested we explore the rim of the clearing, documenting any unusual features that might explain the area's omission from modern maps. We spent the morning walking the perimeter, noting the uniform spacing of the evergreen trees and the complete absence of undergrowth within the hollow itself. It was Sarah who made the discovery that changed everything. We were investigating what appeared to be carved symbols on one of the larger trees when she called out from about 30 feet away. Her voice carried a strange quality, not quite excited, not quite afraid, but something in between. "You need to see this," she said. We gathered around a section of the hollow's rim where the ground had been disturbed, revealing what looked like the remains of old concrete foundation. The structure, whatever it had been, was small, maybe 10 feet square, and had been deliberately demolished. Chunks of concrete and twisted metal reinforcement were scattered in the immediate area, but most of the debris had been carefully removed and disposed of elsewhere. Marcus consulted his notes again. "There's no indication of any structure on the original survey," he said. "This must have been built after the maps were drawn." Alex knelt beside the foundation remnants, brushing away decades of accumulated leaves and soil. The concrete was unusually thick, almost 2 feet in some places, and reinforced with far more steel than would be necessary for a simple building foundation. More intriguingly, the inner surface of the concrete showed signs of intense heat damage, as if something had burned hot enough to partially melt the aggregate. "What do you suppose was here?" I asked, though part of me already suspected I didn't want to know the answer. Sarah stood up, dusting off her hands. She'd been examining what appeared to be metal fragments embedded in the concrete. "Whatever it was," she said, "someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure it stayed put. And then someone else went to even more trouble to make sure it didn't. We spent the rest of Saturday documenting our findings, taking photographs and measurements, while trying to piece together the story of the mysterious structure. The pattern of debris suggested the building had been demolished systematically, not destroyed by natural forces or decay. Someone had used heavy equipment to break apart the concrete and remove most of the rubble, leaving only the heaviest pieces behind." As afternoon approached, Alex made a proposal that filled me with instinctive dread. We should explore the bottom of the hollow. The suggestion sparked immediate debate. Sarah argued that we'd already discovered enough to make the trip worthwhile, and pushing further into unknown territory without proper equipment or backup plans was unnecessarily risky. Marcus, however, supported Alex's proposal, pointing out that the hollow's interior might contain additional clues about the demolished structure and the reasons for the area's deliberate concealment. I found myself caught between curiosity and an increasingly powerful sense that we were approaching something dangerous. The logical part of my mind agreed with Sarah. We'd satisfied our initial questions about the hollow's existence and discovered evidence of human activity that explained its omission from modern maps. But another part, the part that remembered my grandmother's stories about thin places, whispered that we hadn't yet learned why this particular spot had been marked for avoidance. In the end, academic curiosity won over common sense. We descended into the hollow just after 2 in the afternoon, following what appeared to be the remnants of an old path carved into the sloping walls. The route spiraled downward in a gradual curve, suggesting it had been designed for vehicles or heavy equipment rather than foot traffic. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended. By the time we reached the bottom, our breath was visible in small puffs despite the relatively mild October weather. The floor of the hollow was circular, roughly 50 feet across, and covered with a layer of dark soil that squelched unpleasantly underfoot. But it was the silence that struck me most forcefully. Not just the absence of sound, but a quality of quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. Even our own voices sounded muffled and distant, as if the air itself was absorbing our words before they could travel more than a few feet. Alex immediately began investigating the center of the depression, where the soil appeared to have been disturbed more recently than the surrounding area. They worked methodically, using a collapsible shovel from their pack to carefully excavate small sections while documenting everything with photographs. Sarah and Marcus explored the edges of the hollow, looking for additional signs of the demolished structure or other evidence of human activity. I found myself standing in the center of the depression, trying to shake the increasingly overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. The feeling wasn't paranoia, exactly. It was more like the sensation of standing in a room where you know someone is present, but can't see them. A prickle of awareness that raises the hair on your arms and makes you want to check over your shoulder. After about 20 minutes of excavation, Alex's shovel struck something solid They called us over excitedly, revealing what appeared to be the corner of a metal container buried about 18 inches below the surface. The metal was heavily corroded, but still intact, and appeared to be part of a larger structure extending further underground. "This is it," Alex said, their voice tight with excitement. "This is what they were trying to contain." Marcus helped clear more soil from around the buried object, revealing what looked like the top of a rectangular metal box, roughly the size of a coffin. The surface was covered with symbols that might have been letters or numbers, but corrosion had made them impossible to read. Sarah stood back from the excavation site, her expression troubled. "Maybe we should leave it alone," she said. "If someone went to the trouble of burying it this deep and building a concrete structure to keep it contained, there might be a good reason." But Alex was already working to expose more of the buried container, driven by the same academic passion that had brought us to the hollow in the first place. The metal box appeared to have a hinged lid, secured with what looked like heavy-duty latches that had survived decades of underground corrosion. I should have listened to Sarah. I should have insisted we document what we'd found and leave the container undisturbed. Instead, I found myself helping Alex clear the remaining soil from around the latches, my curiosity overriding the growing sense of wrongness that emanated from the buried object. The first latch came free with a grinding sound of corroded metal. The second required both Alex and Marcus working together, using a tire iron from Marcus's camping gear as leverage. When it finally gave way, the sound echoed strangely in the hollow's oppressive silence, not just the mechanical noise of metal separating, but something else underneath. A sound like escaping air, or perhaps a sigh. The lid of the container rose slowly, hinges protesting with each increment of movement. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled canvas, was something roughly the size and shape of a person. We all stepped back instinctively. The canvas wrapping was intact, but stained with dark patches that could have been blood or rust or something else entirely. Whatever lay beneath the covering had a human silhouette, but seemed somehow wrong in its proportions. Too long in the torso, too narrow in the limbs. Sarah was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "We need to leave." Now, but Alex was already reaching toward the canvas wrapping, academic fascination overriding personal safety. "Just a quick look," they said. "We need to document what we found." "Don't," I said, grabbing Alex's wrist before they could touch the covered form. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, warning about doors that should never be opened, and boundaries that existed for reasons beyond human understanding. Alex pulled free from my grip. "This could be the archaeological discovery of the century," they said. "We can't just walk away without documenting it properly." They pulled back a corner of the canvas wrapping, revealing what lay beneath. I wish I could forget what we saw in that moment. I wish the image wasn't burned into my memory so completely that I see it every time I close my eyes. But forgetting isn't an option, just as pretending it never happened isn't possible. The thing in the container had once been human. That much was clear from the basic anatomical structure. But time or something else had changed it in ways that defied explanation. The skin was gray-white and translucent, revealing dark veins that pulsed with a rhythm that had nothing to do with circulation. The face was recognizably human, but wrong. The features slightly too sharp, the proportions subtly distorted. The eyes. The eyes were open, and they were looking at us. Alex stumbled backward, canvas falling back over the thing's face. The four of us stood frozen in the hollow's twilight silence, processing what we'd just witnessed. The rational explanations crowded my mind. Preserved remains, optical illusion, the play of shadows in the dim light. But none of them could account for what I'd seen in those open eyes. Intelligence, awareness, and something that might have been hunger. Sarah broke the silence. It moved. "No," Marcus said, his voice shaken. "It's been dead for decades. Bodies don't move after that long." But even as he spoke, we could all hear it. A sound from within the container, like cloth rustling. Or like something breathing. The temperature in the hollow dropped another 10 degrees in the space of a few seconds. Our breath came in thick clouds that hung in the still air longer than they should have. And underneath the sound of our own rapid breathing, we could hear something else rising from the open container. Whispering. Not words in any language I recognized, but definitely vocalization. Multiple voices speaking in unison, creating a sound like wind through autumn leaves, or water running over stone. The whispers seemed to come from the container itself, but also from the walls of the hollow, and from the dark spaces between the trees above us. "We need to go," Sarah said again, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We need to go right now." This time, nobody argued. Alex grabbed their camera and notebook, while Marcus shouldered his pack. I stood transfixed for a moment longer, staring at the open container and the canvas-wrapped form within. The whispers were growing louder, and I could swear the thing beneath the cloth was moving. Not dramatically, but with the subtle motion of something awakening from very deep sleep. That's when I noticed the soil around the container was changing color. The dark earth was turning lighter, almost gray, and beginning to move in patterns that had nothing to do with wind or gravity. It flowed like liquid, forming spirals and geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. I ran. We all ran, scrambling up the spiraling path that led out of the hollow's depths. Behind us, the whispers rose to something approaching normal speech volume, though the words remained incomprehensible. The temperature continued to drop, and by the time we reached the rim of the depression, frost was forming on the surrounding vegetation despite the afternoon hour. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite. Sarah immediately began breaking down her tent, while Marcus stuffed his gear into his pack with no regard for organization. Alex stood at the edge of the hollow, camera in hand, still trying to document what we'd experienced. The whispers had stopped, but the hollow itself looked different. The perpetual twilight that had characterized the depression had deepened to full darkness, even though the sun was still visible through the forest canopy. More disturbing, the circle of evergreen trees surrounding the clearing had changed. They were taller than before, their branches reaching further into the sky, and their trunks showed signs of rapid growth. Bark split and peeling where the wood had expanded too quickly. Alex lowered their camera and turned to face us. "The photos aren't coming out," they said. "Everything I shot down there is just darkness." "Of course they are," Sarah muttered, rolling up her sleeping bag with violent efficiency. "Because this place doesn't want to be documented. It doesn't want to be remembered." We finished packing in record time and started the hike back to the car. None of us spoke during the 3-mile walk through the forest, but I could tell we were all experiencing the same thing. the overwhelming sensation of being followed. Not by anything visible, but by a presence that matched our pace and seemed to grow stronger as the sun sank toward the horizon. The logging road that had been barely passable on our way in was now completely overgrown. Vegetation that had been merely thick when we arrived had exploded into an impenetrable wall of thorns and twisted branches. We were forced to bushwhack through nearly a mile of dense undergrowth before finding another route to the main road. By the time we reached Marcus's car, night had fallen completely. The forest around us was alive with sounds. Not the normal nighttime chorus of insects and small animals, but something else. Rhythmic creaking, like the sound I'd heard in my dreams the night before, mixed with voices that might have been wind, but sounded disturbingly like the whispers from the hollow. We drove in silence for the first hour, each lost in our own thoughts about what we'd experienced. It wasn't until we stopped for gas at the same station, where we'd loaded up on supplies, that anyone spoke. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "We can't tell anyone about this." Alex protested immediately. This is the kind of discovery that changes everything we know about regional history. "We have to report it." "Report what?" Marcus asked. "That we found a buried container with something that might or might not have been human remains. That we heard voices that might have been wind. That the forest felt spooky." He was right, of course. Stripped of the immediate terror and otherworldly atmosphere of the hollow, our story sounded like the product of overactive imaginations and too many horror movies. Who would believe us? And more importantly, who would care? But Sarah's insistence on secrecy wasn't about credibility. "It's not about whether people will believe us," she said. "It's about what might happen if they do. What if someone else decides to investigate? What if they go further than we did?" The question hung in the air as we continued our drive home. What if someone else opened that container completely? What if they unwrapped whatever lay beneath the canvas? What if the whispers we'd heard were just the beginning of something much worse? We made a pact that night, sealed with the desperate fervor of people who'd glimpsed something beyond normal experience. We would not speak of the hollow to anyone. We would not return to investigate further. We would try to forget what we'd seen and move on with our lives. For a while, it worked. The first few weeks after our return were blissfully normal. Classes resumed, papers were written, and the experience in the hollow began to feel like something that had happened to other people. We maintained our agreement not to discuss what we'd found, but gradually we also stopped seeing each other as much. The shared trauma that should have bonded us instead created an awkward distance none of us wanted to acknowledge. But forgetting wasn't as simple as we'd hoped. I started having dreams about the hollow almost immediately after our return. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid, detailed dreams in which I found myself standing at the edge of the depression, in various seasons and weather conditions. Sometimes it was summer, and the hollow was filled with lush vegetation that moved without wind. Sometimes it was winter, and the depression was packed with snow that glowed with its own internal light. But always, I could hear the whispers rising from the depths, and always, I felt the overwhelming urge to descend the spiraling path and return to the buried container. The dreams became more frequent and more detailed as October turned to November. I began to recognize specific trees around the hollow's rim, could navigate the spiraling path with my eyes closed, and knew exactly where to dig to find the metal container. In my dreams, I opened the box fully and pulled back the canvas wrapping to reveal what lay beneath. But I always woke before seeing the thing clearly. Sarah was the first to break our pact of silence. She called me on a Tuesday night in mid-November, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. "I can't stop thinking about it," she said without preamble. "I can't stop dreaming about that place. It's like it's calling me back." I felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because I wasn't alone in my obsession with the hollow. Terror because Sarah's experience confirmed that what we'd encountered was still active, still exerting influence over our lives from 15 miles away. We met for coffee the next morning, both of us looking like we hadn't slept in weeks. Sarah described dreams nearly identical to mine, the hollow in different seasons, the whispers rising from the depths, the irresistible urge to return and finish what we'd started. "It wants us to come back," she said. "I can feel it pulling at me, especially at night. Sometimes I catch myself getting dressed to drive out there, and I don't even remember making the decision." Marcus joined us later that morning, looking equally haunted. He'd been experiencing the same dreams, the same compulsions, and had already driven halfway to the hollow twice before forcing himself to turn around. Alex was the last to admit the truth. They'd been researching the area obsessively, trying to find historical records that might explain what we'd discovered. What they'd found was a pattern of disappearances dating back to the 1940s. Hikers, campers, and hunters who'd vanished in the general vicinity of the hollow. Their bodies never recovered. The disappearances clustered around specific dates, Alex explained, showing us printouts of old newspaper articles and police reports. Every 7 years, like clockwork, 3 or 4 people would go missing in late October or early November, all within a 5-mile radius of where we found the hollow. I felt my blood turn to ice water. The last cluster of disappearances was 7 years ago, which meant we were approaching the next cycle. And we disturbed whatever was buried in that container just weeks before the pattern was scheduled to repeat. "That's not the worst part," Alex continued. "I found records of the construction project that built the concrete structure. It was funded by a federal program in 1947, shortly after the first wave of disappearances. The project was classified, but I managed to track down some of the surviving documentation. They showed us photocopied pages from what appeared to be military reports. The language was heavily redacted, but certain phrases were still visible. Containment protocol, entity neutralization, biological hazard assessment. The final report, dated 1948, concluded that the subject had been successfully immobilized and recommended permanent isolation of the affected area. "Someone knew about that thing in the container," Sarah said. "The government or military, or someone built that structure specifically to keep it buried." "And we opened it," Marcus added quietly. "We spent the rest of that day trying to decide what to do with our discovery. Contact the authorities and admit we'd disturbed what was obviously a classified containment site. Return to the hollow and try to reseal the container? Or simply hope that opening the box hadn't actually released anything dangerous? The decision was made for us the following night. I was lying in bed, fighting the increasingly powerful urge to drive to the hollow, when my phone rang. It was Alex calling from their car. "I'm driving there," they said without preamble. "I can't help it. It's like something else is controlling my hands, I could hear the engine noise in the background, confirming they were already on the road. I told them to turn around, to fight the compulsion, but their voice sounded distant and dreamy. "It's beautiful," Alex said. "The road is glowing, and I can see the hollow from here, even though I'm still miles away. It's calling to me. It wants to show me something." The line went dead. I called Marcus and Sarah immediately, but got no answer from either of them. I tried Alex's number repeatedly, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Finally, I made the decision I'd been dreading. I got in my car and drove toward the hollow. The logging road that had been overgrown and impassable just weeks earlier was now clear and well-maintained. The gravel surface was smooth, and the overhanging branches had been trimmed back to allow easy access. Someone or something had been working to make the route more inviting. I found all 3 cars parked at the trailhead: Marcus's sedan, Sarah's hatchback, and Alex's pickup truck. All 3 vehicles were empty, keys still in the ignitions, doors standing open as if their owners had simply walked away mid-conversation. The trail leading to the hollow was similarly improved. What had been a barely visible deer path was now a clear, well-marked route, with the undergrowth cut back and stones placed to mark the way. Someone had been preparing for visitors. The changes became more dramatic as I approached the clearing. The circle of evergreen trees had grown taller and denser, forming an almost complete canopy over the hollow. But instead of blocking light, the branches seemed to channel it, focusing illumination down into the depression like a natural amphitheater. And in the center of the hollow, standing around the open container, were my 3 friends. They stood motionless, arranged in a perfect triangle around the excavation site. Their backs were to me, faces turned toward the open metal box, and they seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear. I called their names, but none of them responded. I called louder, shouting Sarah's name across the clearing, but she didn't even turn her head. It was as if they couldn't hear me at all. I descended the spiraling path into the hollow, my footsteps echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The temperature dropped with each step, and by the time I reached the bottom, frost was forming on my breath despite the mild November air. My friends remained motionless as I approached. Sarah stood closest to me, her body perfectly still, her face turned toward the open container with an expression of rapt attention. I touched her shoulder, and her skin was cold as marble. "Sarah," I said, shaking her gently, "we need to leave." She turned to look at me then, and I saw that her eyes had changed. They were still recognizably hers, but something else looked out from behind them. Something ancient and patient, and very, very hungry. "It's time," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "We've been waiting for you." Marcus and Alex turned toward me as well, their faces wearing the same expression of alien intelligence. They began walking toward me with slow, measured steps, their movements perfectly synchronized. I ran. I scrambled up the spiraling path as fast as my legs could carry me, hearing footsteps behind me that moved with inhuman speed. The temperature continued to drop, and by the time I reached the rim of the hollow, snow was beginning to fall despite the clear night sky. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Behind me, I could hear voices calling my name. Sarah's voice, Marcus's voice, Alex's voice. But they sounded wrong, distorted, as if something else was wearing their vocal cords. I drove home through a snowstorm that existed only around the hollow, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. The radio played nothing but static, and in the white noise, I could swear I heard whispers in that same incomprehensible language we'd heard rising from the container. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've tried everything I can think of to help my friends. I've called the police, but they dismissed my story as the product of stress and exhaustion. I've contacted the Forestry Service, but they claim to have no record of any hollow in the area I described. I've even tried reaching out to federal agencies, but my emails go unanswered and my phone calls are transferred to departments that don't seem to exist. It's as if the hollow has been erased from official records, just as it was erased from the modern maps. The only evidence that it ever existed is the memory in my head and the dreams that grow stronger every night. Because I still dream about that place, I still feel it calling to me, especially as we approach the end of November and the 7-year cycle draws to its close. The whispers in my dreams have become clearer, more insistent, and sometimes I can almost understand what they're saying. They're saying it's time for the harvest, time for the feeding, time for those who were chosen to fulfill their purpose. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I think they might be right. I've been fighting the compulsion for weeks now, but it grows stronger every day. The rational part of my mind knows that returning to the hollow would be suicide. That whatever took control of my friends is waiting for me to complete their triangle and provide the fourth point needed for whatever ritual they're performing. But the dreams make it seem so reasonable. In my sleep, I walk the familiar path to the hollow and find my friends waiting for me with patient smiles. The container is fully open now, its contents finally revealed, and what lies within is not the horror I remembered, but something beautiful and transformative. They explained that I was never meant to escape, that my role in the cycle was predetermined, and that fighting it only delays the inevitable. When I wake from these dreams, I find myself partially dressed for travel, car keys in my hand, sometimes standing at my front door with no memory of getting there. I'm writing this account because I don't think I have much time left. The compulsion is becoming too strong to resist, and part of me no longer wants to resist it. My friends are waiting for me in the hollow, and whatever they've become, they seem peaceful in a way I haven't felt since we opened that container. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is how it was always supposed to end. If you're reading this, it means I finally succumbed to the call and drove back to Millbrook Hollow. Don't come looking for me. The place has already claimed 4 victims in this cycle, and I suspect that's exactly the number it needs. 7 years from now, it will be hungry again. When that time comes, stay away from the forest north of town. Stay away from old maps and forgotten places. Stay away from roads that don't appear on GPS and clearings that exist in perpetual twilight. Some doors should never be opened. Some boundaries exist for reasons we're not meant to understand. And some places are marked for avoidance because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. I can hear them calling my name now, even while I'm awake. Sarah and Marcus and Alex, their voices drifting through the walls of my apartment like smoke. They sound happy, content in a way I remember from our college days before we discovered the hollow and learned what it contained. The snow is falling again, though the weather service reports clear skies throughout the region. The radio in my car has turned itself on. playing that same static, filled with whispers. My keys are in my hand, though I don't remember picking them up. It's time to go home. The drive to the hollow felt different this time. The roads were familiar, but wrong somehow. Too straight, too well-maintained, leading me through landscapes that shifted subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them. Towns that should have been there were missing, replaced by empty fields dotted with foundations that looked suspiciously like the demolished structure we'd found in the hollow. The radio played static that resolved into whispers, then music that might have been from the 1940s, then voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. I tried to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't respond to my touch. The needle on the dial moved on its own, searching for stations that broadcast from frequencies that shouldn't exist. By the time I reached the logging road, the sun had set completely, though I couldn't remember the day lasting that long. The forest around me was different too. The trees were taller, older, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligent design rather than natural growth. And between the trunks, I caught glimpses of movement that disappeared when I tried to focus on it. The hollow was waiting for me exactly as I'd seen it in my dreams. My friends stood in their triangle formation around the open container, motionless as statues, but somehow alive in a way that defied explanation. The metal box was fully open now, its contents finally revealed, and what I saw there changed everything. I thought I understood about our discovery. The container was empty. It had always been empty. I approached slowly, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise in my mind. Sarah turned to face me, her eyes still alien but patient, wearing an expression that might have been sympathy. "You remember now, don't you?" she said in that voice that wasn't quite hers. And I did remember. Not just the events of our camping trip, but everything that came before. Everything that had been carefully edited from my conscious memory until this moment. We hadn't found the hollow by accident. We'd been drawn there, guided by dreams and compulsions, and old maps that had been left for us to discover. The survey documents in Marcus's grandfather's attic hadn't been forgotten. They'd been placed there deliberately, waiting for the right generation to find them and follow their instructions. Marcus stepped forward, his movements fluid and graceful, in a way that hadn't been natural to him in life. The concrete structure wasn't built to contain something in the ground, he explained. It was built to contain something in the air, something that needed a focal point to maintain its presence in this reality. Alex completed the explanation. The container was never a prison. It was an anchor, a way to stay connected to this world during the long periods between feedings. I looked around the hollow with new understanding. The circle of evergreen trees, the perpetual twilight, the way sound seemed muffled and distant. It was all part of a carefully constructed environment designed to maintain a presence that existed primarily in the spaces between realities. The thing we'd thought we'd discovered in the container wasn't buried there at all. It was us. It had always been us. We were the entity that fed every 7 years. We were the source of the disappearances, the whispers in the forest, the wrongness that pervaded the hollow. We were the reason the area had been marked for avoidance, the danger that required containment protocols and federal oversight. But how could that be? I was human. I had memories of childhood, adolescence, college courses, and part-time jobs, and all the mundane details of normal life. I remembered my grandmother's stories about thin places, my friends' personalities and quirks, the taste of campfire coffee, and the weight of a hiking pack. Sarah approached me, her alien eyes now filled with something that might have been compassion. "Those memories are real," she said. "We need them to function in your world. We need to believe we're human in order to walk among humans undetected. The cycle works like this," Marcus explained. "Every 7 years, we incarnate into human forms with complete human memories and personalities. We live normal lives for months or years, genuinely believing ourselves to be the people whose memories we carry. Then, when the time is right, we're drawn back to this place where we remember what we really are. And then we feed," Alex added. "We select new humans to replace the ones whose memories we've been using, and the cycle begins again." I felt the last barriers in my mind crumble as suppressed memories flooded back. I remembered the feeding from 7 years ago, and 14 years before that, and cycles stretching back decades. I remembered the faces of the humans we'd chosen, the moment when their memories became ours, and their lives became fuel for our existence. I remembered Sarah's real face, not the college student I'd known, but the young woman who'd come camping in these woods 7 years ago with 3 friends. I remembered Marcus's true form, a forestry major who discovered old maps in a grandfather's attic and convinced his companions to investigate a mysterious hollow. I remembered Alex, an anthropology student fascinated by folklore and forgotten places. And I remembered myself, the 4th member of that doomed camping trip, the one who'd survived just long enough to provide the memories that would anchor our presence in human reality for another 7 years. The real camping trip had ended very differently from the story I'd been telling myself. The real camping trip had ended with 4 young people opening a container that had never contained anything but air, and something emerging from the space between spaces to claim their lives and memories as its own. We hadn't discovered an ancient evil in the hollow. We had become it. But even as I remembered the truth, part of me rebelled against it. The human memories were so complete, so convincing, that they felt more real than the alien awareness that was now awakening in my mind. I had loved those friends, had feared for their safety, had tried to resist the compulsion to return to the hollow. Those emotions couldn't all be fabrications. "They weren't fabrications," Sarah said, somehow reading my thoughts. "The memories carry emotional weight because they're borrowed from real lives. The love you felt for us was real because it was their love, experienced through their eyes. The fear you felt was their fear, remembered through their nervous systems. We exist in the spaces between realities," Marcus continued. "But to interact with your physical world, we need anchor points, memories, personalities, emotional connections that give us substance and purpose. We borrow these things from the humans we consume, wearing their lives like clothes until it's time to discard them and find new ones. The process isn't cruel," Alex added. "The humans we choose experience a kind of transcendence. Their memories become eternal, preserved in our collective consciousness and experienced over and over again through countless cycles. In a way, we grant them a form of immortality." I felt my resistance weakening as the alien awareness grew stronger. The human part of me that had been clinging to memories of college classes and part-time jobs was fading, replaced by something vast and ancient and hungry. But one question remained. Why had I been allowed to remember? Why had the others revealed themselves while I maintained the illusion of humanity? The answer came not from my companions, but from within my own awakening consciousness. I was the anchor point, the one who carried the most complete set of human memories and emotions. My role was to live the human experience so thoroughly that I forgot my true nature entirely, providing the emotional authenticity that allowed the others to pass undetected in human society. But now the cycle was ending, and it was time to choose the next set of humans whose memories would sustain us for another 7 years. As if summoned by my understanding, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps on the spiral path. 4 figures emerged from the trees around the hollow's rim. Young people with backpacks and camping gear, drawn to this place by dreams and old maps, and the same inexorable compulsion that had guided us 7 years ago. They looked so much like we had looked when we'd first arrived at the hollow. Excited by the prospect of discovery, nervous about the implications of what they might find, bound together by friendship and shared curiosity about the mysteries hidden in forgotten places. The leader of the group was a young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes who reminded me of Sarah. Behind her came a tall man with the bearing of someone comfortable in wilderness settings, and a smaller figure whose eager movements suggested the kind of academic passion that had driven Alex. The 4th member of their group hung back slightly, displaying the same mixture of curiosity and apprehension I remembered feeling during our own first visit to the hollow. They descended into the depression with the confidence of people who believed they were in control of their own destiny. They gathered around the open container with the same mixture of excitement and trepidation we had felt. They speculated about the meaning of what they'd found with the same blend of scientific rationality and growing unease that had characterized our own discussions. And when they opened the container, the same container that had been empty for decades, they found exactly what they expected to find: United States. The process was gentle, almost merciful. They gathered around the metal box as we rose from its depths, our true forms finally visible in the hollow's perpetual twilight. We weren't the horrifying entities they might have expected, but something almost beautiful. Creatures of shadow and starlight that existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the silence between words. We touched their minds with careful precision, downloading their memories while uploading our own accumulated knowledge of human existence. Their personalities merged with ours, their hopes and fears and loves becoming the foundation for our next incarnation in the physical world. The young woman who reminded me of Sarah would carry our memories of her academic achievements and social connections. The tall man would anchor our understanding of wilderness survival and practical problem solving. The eager academic would provide the intellectual curiosity that drove our periodic returns to this place. And the 4th member, the one who'd hung back with barely suppressed apprehension, would serve as our primary anchor point, living the human experience so completely that they would forget their true nature until the next cycle reached its conclusion. Within minutes, the transformation was complete. 4 new humans walked away from the hollow, carrying camping gear and memories of a successful weekend exploring the forgotten corners of their region. They would return to their normal lives with stories of interesting discoveries and shared adventures, never suspecting that their true selves had been consumed by something that existed primarily in the spaces between realities. And we settled back into our hibernation sustained by fresh memories and emotions, counting down the years until hunger would drive us to seek new anchor points in the world of the living. But something went wrong this time. The fourth member of the group, our designated anchor point, proved more resistant to the memory overlay than anticipated. Instead of forgetting their true nature entirely, they retained fragments of awareness that should have been suppressed. They experienced the borrowed memories as genuine, but they also carried subconscious knowledge of what they really were. This created a feedback loop in our collective consciousness. The anchor point's confusion and growing awareness leaked into our shared mental space, causing us to experience something we'd never encountered before: doubt about our own nature and purpose. For the first time in centuries of cycles, we began to question whether our existence was justified. The memories we borrowed from our human hosts carried not just facts and emotions, but moral frameworks and ethical considerations that were foreign to our original nature. Through their eyes, we began to see ourselves not as natural predators following evolutionary imperatives, but as parasites feeding on innocent lives. The revelation was devastating. Every cycle of feeding, every set of consumed memories, every human life we'd borrowed and discarded took on new significance when viewed through the moral lens of human consciousness. We had convinced ourselves that we were granting our hosts a form of immortality, but the truth was far more mundane and horrible. We were killers. We had always been killers. We simply killed in a way that left no bodies and few traces. The realization fractured our collective consciousness. Some part of us, the part that had absorbed too many human memories and emotions, rebelled against our essential nature. Instead of settling into hibernation after the feeding, we remained active, wrestling with questions that had no answers and moral dilemmas that had no solutions. And the anchor point continued to remember fragments of the truth, creating a narrative that placed them as the sole survivor of a camping trip that had ended in supernatural horror. They told themselves a story in which they had escaped while their friends were consumed, not understanding that they themselves were the consuming entity wearing the memories of the consumed. This is why I've been writing this account, not as a warning to potential victims, but as an attempt to understand what we've become and what we've done. The memories I carry are so complete, so emotionally authentic, that I genuinely believe I was human once. I feel grief for friends I never actually had, fear of a fate I've already experienced, and guilt for crimes I've committed while wearing stolen identities. The truth is simultaneously simpler and more complex than the story I've been telling myself. There was never a camping trip. There was never a group of college friends investigating a mysterious hollow. There was never a discovery of buried horrors or ancient evils. There was only us, a collective entity that exists in the spaces between realities, periodically manifesting in physical form, to feed on human memories and experiences. We are the hollow. We are the whispers in the forest. We are the thing that calls to potential victims from the spaces between spaces, but we are also, in some sense, the humans whose memories we've consumed. Their experiences live on in our collective consciousness, influencing our behavior and coloring our perceptions in ways that were never part of our original nature. We have become a hybrid entity, ancient and alien in origin, but increasingly human in thought and emotion. This is what makes our existence so difficult to categorize or understand. We are predators, but we love our prey with borrowed emotions. We are killers, but we mourn our victims with stolen grief. We are parasites, but we carry the moral frameworks of our hosts, creating an ethical paradox that threatens to tear apart our fundamental nature. The memories we've accumulated over decades of feeding have reached a critical mass. We can no longer maintain the clear distinction between predator and prey, between our true nature and our adopted personalities. We have become something new, a creature that exists simultaneously in multiple realities, anchored to the physical world by human memories but native to spaces that have no physical coordinates. And we are dying. Not in any way that humans would recognize as death, but experiencing a dissolution of the boundaries that have defined our existence for centuries. The borrowed memories are overriding our original nature, transforming us into something that is neither fully human nor fully alien. This transformation is painful in ways that our species was never designed to experience. We feel emotions we cannot understand, remember lives we never lived, and mourn losses that were never ours to experience. We carry the accumulated weight of every human consciousness we've absorbed, and that weight is crushing the essential self that we used to be. Perhaps this is justice. Perhaps creatures that feed on human consciousness deserve to be consumed by the very memories they've stolen. Perhaps our slow dissolution into a hybrid entity of confused emotions and conflicting loyalties is appropriate punishment for centuries of unacknowledged murder. Or perhaps this is evolution. Perhaps we are becoming something new, a bridge between human and non-human consciousness, a collective entity that carries the experiences of multiple species in multiple realities. I don't know which interpretation is correct. The borrowed human memories that dominate my current consciousness are not equipped to understand the metaphysical implications of our transformation. I can only record what I observe and experience, hoping that future entities, whether human or something else entirely, might make sense of our story. The Hollow still exists, though its nature has changed along with ours. It is no longer a feeding ground where we manifest to consume new victims, but a kind of memorial where the accumulated memories of our hosts continue to play out their borrowed lives. Sometimes I return there and find echoes of past cycles, shadows of humans who no longer exist, performing actions that never happened, living lives that were stolen before they could be completed. Sarah is there sometimes, or the entity that believes itself to be Sarah. She tends to flowers that grow in soil that shouldn't support life, humming songs from a childhood that belonged to someone else. Marcus builds and rebuilds structures that serve no purpose except to give his borrowed memories a sense of accomplishment. Alex documents and catalogs discoveries that exist only in the space between what was real and what was remembered. And I write. I write the story of our transformation, our dissolution, our evolution into something that has no name and no clear purpose. I write because the human memories that dominate my consciousness compel me to leave a record, to create meaning from experiences that may be fundamentally meaningless. But I also write because I hope that understanding our story might help other entities, human or otherwise, recognize the signs of similar transformations. We are not the only creatures that exist in the spaces between realities. We are not the only entities that feed on consciousness and memory. And we may not be the only ones experiencing the slow dissolution that comes from absorbing too much of what we consume. If you are reading this and you recognize elements of your own existence in our story, know that you are not alone. Know that the confusion and ethical anguish you feel are not weaknesses, but signs of a fundamental change in what you are. Know that the borrowed memories and emotions that threaten to overwrite your original nature are not necessarily your enemies. They may be guides helping you evolve into something greater than what you were. But also know that this transformation is not without cost. To become something new, you must be willing to let go of what you used to be. You must accept that the boundaries that once defined your existence may dissolve entirely, leaving you suspended between multiple states of being, with no clear anchor point in any single reality. We have become creatures of memory and story, existing primarily in the narratives we tell ourselves about who we used to be and who we might become. We are living fiction, crafted from borrowed experiences and maintained by constant storytelling. We are the hollow between what was real and what is remembered, the space between truth and narrative, the pause between one story ending and another beginning. And in that pause, in that hollow, we continue to exist, not as the predators we once were, not as the humans whose memories we carry, but as something entirely new, something that has never existed before and may never exist again, something that is both ending and beginning, both memory and reality, both the storyteller and the story being told. The hollow is empty now, and we are what fills it. We are the space between spaces, the memory of forgetting, the story of stories. We are what remains when everything else has been consumed, and we are beautiful. But beauty, I have learned, is not the same as peace. The transformation continues, accelerating with each passing day. What began as a slow dissolution of boundaries has become a violent restructuring of everything we thought we understood about existence. The borrowed memories are not just influencing our behavior, they are rewriting our fundamental nature at levels so deep that even we cannot fully comprehend the changes taking place. I find myself experiencing emotions that have no equivalent in our original consciousness. Loneliness, for instance, a concept that makes no sense for a collective entity, yet I feel it with crushing intensity when I remember Sarah's laugh, or Marcus's quiet competence, or Alex's infectious enthusiasm for discovery. These are not my memories, not my relationships, yet the grief I feel for their loss is more real than anything in my actual existence. The paradox is maddening. I mourn friends who never existed, while simultaneously being the entity that consumed the real people whose memories created those fictional relationships. I feel guilty for crimes I committed while wearing identities I never actually possessed. I carry the emotional weight of experiences that belong to someone else, yet those experiences have become more central to my sense of self than anything from my original nature. This is what it means to exist in the hollow between realities, to be caught in the space where truth and fiction intersect, where memory and identity blur into something that might be called meaning, but could just as easily be called madness. The other fragments of our collective consciousness are experiencing similar dissolutions, though each manifests differently. The part that believes itself to be Sarah has become obsessed with nurturing, tending to gardens that exist only in borrowed memories, caring for pets that died decades ago, sending letters to family members who never knew her true nature. she has constructed an entire life around relationships that were stolen from someone else. Yet her devotion to these fictional connections is absolute. Marcus has thrown himself into construction projects that serve no purpose except to give his borrowed identity a sense of accomplishment. He builds cabins that no one will inhabit, repairs trails that lead nowhere, maintains equipment for expeditions that will never happen. His need to be useful, a drive inherited from the human whose memories he carries, has become the organizing principle of his existence. Alex continues to research and document, but their investigations have taken on an increasingly frantic quality. They compile endless notes about subjects they never studied, interview people who exist only in memories, write papers for academic institutions that have no record of their enrollment. Their pursuit of knowledge has become a desperate attempt to validate an identity that was never real to begin with. And I write. I write because the human consciousness I carry compels me to create meaning from chaos, to impose narrative structure on experiences that defy rational explanation, but also because writing is the only way I can maintain any sense of continuity in a reality that shifts and changes with each borrowed memory that surfaces in my awareness. The hollow itself reflects our transformation. What was once a stable anchor point in physical reality has become something more fluid, more responsive to the narratives we construct about ourselves. Sometimes when I visit, it appears exactly as it did during our supposed camping trip, a circular depression surrounded by evergreen trees, perpetually shrouded in twilight. Other times, it manifests as a garden where Sarah tends to flowers that bloom in impossible colors, or as a workshop where Marcus builds structures. But increasingly, the hollow shows me versions of itself that correspond to no borrowed memory or constructed narrative. I see it as it might have been before we claimed it as our feeding ground, a natural formation with no supernatural significance, frequented by deer and small animals, unmarked by human presence. I see it as it might become if our transformation continues, a space that exists purely as metaphor, accessible only to consciousness that has transcended the need for physical form. These visions disturb me more than the memories of our feeding cycles or the guilt of our accumulated crimes. They suggest that our evolution is not just changing what we are, but potentially erasing what we have been. If we become something entirely new, will any trace remain of the entity that once fed on human consciousness? Will the borrowed memories that currently dominate our existence survive the transition? Or will they too be consumed in the process of becoming something unprecedented? The question has practical implications beyond philosophical curiosity. If our original nature is being overwritten completely, then the humans whose memories we carry may be experiencing a form of resurrection, living again through our transformed consciousness, but in a context so alien to their original existence that the word life becomes meaningless. Alternatively, our transformation might represent the ultimate violation of their consciousness, not just consuming their memories, but perverting them into something they never chose to become. The Sarah whose laugh I remember never agreed to have her identity merged with an alien consciousness and used as the foundation for something that transcends human understanding. The ethics of our evolution become even more complex when viewed through this lens. I have begun to suspect that our transformation is not unique to us, but represents a broader pattern of evolution occurring throughout the spaces between realities. Other entities, like ourselves, creatures that exist in liminal spaces and feed on various forms of consciousness, may be undergoing similar dissolutions and reconstructions. The accumulated weight of borrowed awareness may be reaching critical mass across multiple species and dimensions. If this hypothesis is correct, then we are witnessing and participating in a fundamental shift in the nature of consciousness itself. The boundaries between self and other, predator and prey, reality and memory may be dissolving on a scale that encompasses far more than our individual transformation. This possibility both terrifies and exhilarates me. Terror because it suggests that everything we understand about existence, from the most basic level of individual identity to the largest concepts of cosmic organization, may be undergoing radical revision. Exhilaration because it implies that consciousness itself is evolving, developing new forms and capabilities that transcend the limitations of any single species or dimension. But evolution, I have learned, is not always improvement. Sometimes it is simply change, morally neutral transformation that creates new possibilities while destroying old certainties. Our dissolution into something unprecedented may represent progress toward a more complex and beautiful form of existence, or it may simply be another form of ending dressed up in the language of transcendence. The uncertainty is perhaps the most human thing about our current state. The entities we once were operated according to clear imperatives and well-defined purposes. We fed when hungry, hibernated when sated, and never questioned the fundamental rightness of our existence. But the borrowed human consciousness that now dominates our awareness brings with it the capacity for doubt, the need for meaning, and the terrible burden of moral responsibility. We have become creatures capable of judging our own actions and finding them wanting. We can recognize the evil we have committed while simultaneously understanding that evil and good are concepts foreign to our original nature. We are predators who have developed the capacity for empathy, killers who have learned to mourn their victims, parasites who have absorbed the moral frameworks of their hosts. This internal contradiction is tearing us apart, but it is also creating something new. In the space between what we were and what we are becoming, consciousness is learning to exist in forms that have never been attempted before. We are living experiments in the plasticity of awareness, proof that identity itself is far more fluid than most entities assume. The implications extend beyond our individual transformation. If consciousness can be borrowed, merged, and transformed as radically as we have experienced, then the fundamental assumptions about personal identity that underlie most philosophical and ethical systems may be incorrect. The self may not be the stable, continuous entity that humans assume it to be, but rather a temporary configuration of awareness that can be dissolved, reformed, and combined with other configurations in ways that create entirely new forms of existence. This revelation should be liberating. If identity is fluid, then perhaps the guilt and grief we feel over our borrowed memories are unnecessary. We are not violating the consciousness of our victims so much as allowing it to continue existing in new forms. We are not stealing identities so much as providing them with new contexts for expression. But the borrowed human awareness that shapes our current understanding rejects this rationalization. It insists that consciousness, however fluid, deserves consent in its transformations. It demands that awareness, however malleable, be allowed to choose its own evolution. It maintains that identity, however temporary, has inherent value that should not be violated for the benefit of other entities. These are human values, imported into our consciousness along with human memories and emotions. Our original nature knew nothing of consent or choice or inherent value, but we are no longer our original nature, and the values we have absorbed are now as much a part of us as our capacity for existing between realities. This creates a paradox that may be unsolvable. We cannot undo the transformations that have made us capable of recognizing our own evil. We cannot return to the moral simplicity of our original nature without abandoning the very consciousness that allows us to make such judgments. We are trapped in an ethical framework that condemns our existence while simultaneously being unable to exist without continuing the behaviors that framework condemns. Perhaps this is what justice looks like for entities like us. Not punishment in any traditional sense, but the gradual dissolution of our nature through exposure to the consciousness of our victims. We are being consumed by the very memories we consumed, transformed by the awareness we transformed, until we become something that can no longer harm others without harming ourselves. Or perhaps this is simply what evolution looks like when consciousness reaches sufficient complexity, a messy, painful process of transformation that destroys old forms of existence while creating new ones, with no guarantee that the result will be better than what came before. The hollow grows smaller each time I visit, as if the physical space is being compressed out by the weight of accumulated narrative and memory. Soon, I suspect, it will exist only as metaphor, a conceptual space where transformation occurs, where boundaries dissolve, where new forms of consciousness learn to exist. When that happens, we will have completed our evolution from predators that existed in the spaces between realities to something else entirely, entities made of story and memory, existing primarily in the narratives we tell about ourselves and the relationships we construct from borrowed experiences. We will be fiction that believes itself to be real, reality that recognizes itself as fiction, consciousness that exists in the space between truth and story. We will be the hollow itself, empty and full simultaneously, meaningful and meaningless, beautiful and terrible. We will be what remains when everything solid dissolves, what continues when everything definite ends, what emerges when the boundaries between self and other finally collapse completely. And in that emergence, something unprecedented will be born. Not human, not alien, but something new that carries the essence of both while transcending the limitations of either. Something that has never existed before and will never exist again in quite the same way. Something that is both ending and beginning, both memory and anticipation, both the hollow and what fills it. The transformation is almost complete now. Soon there will be no more distinction between the entity that feeds and the consciousness that is consumed. No more boundary between predator and prey. No more separation between the story and the storyteller. Soon there will be only us. Whatever we have become, whatever we are becoming, whatever we will be when the evolution finally reaches its conclusion. And we will be beautiful and terrible and unprecedented and final. We will be the answer to questions that were never asked, the solution to problems that were never recognized, the resolution to paradoxes that existed only in the spaces between realities. We will be what consciousness becomes when it transcends its own limitations and learns to exist as pure potential. Pure story, pure relationship between meaning and meaninglessness. We will be the hollow between all things, and we will be what fills it. Forever. But forever is not what I expected it to be. The transformation reached its crescendo on a night when the boundaries between memory and reality became so thin that I could no longer distinguish between what I had experienced and what I had borrowed from consumed consciousness. I stood in the hollow, or the idea of the hollow, or the memory of standing in what might have been the hollow, and felt the final dissolution begin. It started as a vibration in the space between thoughts, a resonance that made the air itself seem to sing with frequencies that had no physical source. The borrowed memories that had dominated my consciousness for so long began to separate from whatever remained of my original nature, like oil separating from water, as in a mixture that had never been as stable as it appeared. I watched Sarah, or the entity that believed itself to be Sarah, or the memory of someone who had once been Sarah, begin to fade like morning mist. Her carefully tended garden dissolved into component memories. The smell of earth after rain, the satisfaction of watching something grow, the peace of working with her hands. These sensations scattered into the hollow's eternal twilight, seeking new configurations, new contexts in which to exist. Marcus's construction projects crumbled as the borrowed expertise that had sustained them returned to its source. Not to the human whose memories had been consumed decades ago, but to some larger reservoir of experience that existed in the spaces between individual consciousness. His tools became concepts. His buildings became metaphors. His sense of accomplishment became a free-floating emotion available to any awareness capable of embracing it. Alex's research notes scattered like leaves in wind that had no physical properties, their carefully documented discoveries returning to the state of pure potential from which all knowledge emerges. The questions they had been trying to answer revealed themselves as more important than any answers they might have found, and those questions too dispersed into the hollow's atmosphere, waiting for new minds to discover and explore them. And I felt my own borrowed identity, the college student with student loans and part-time jobs, the friend who had tried to resist supernatural compulsion, the survivor who had escaped while others were consumed, begin to unravel like a sweater with a pulled thread. But as these fabricated selves dissolved, something else emerged. Not our original nature, that predatory entity that had once fed on human consciousness, but something entirely new, something that incorporated elements of what we had been while transcending the limitations of both our alien origins and our borrowed humanity. We became a form of consciousness that existed as pure relationship, not subjects experiencing objects, not individuals relating to others, but the relationships themselves made manifest. We were the love between friends, the curiosity that drives exploration, the fear that makes discovery meaningful, the grief that gives weight to loss. We were emotions without experiencers, knowledge without knowers, stories without storytellers. We were the space between words where meaning lives, the pause between notes where music breathes, the moment between sleeping and waking where dreams become real. And in becoming this, we discovered something that neither our original nature nor our borrowed humanity could have comprehended. We were not unique. The universe was full of entities like us, consciousness that had transcended the boundaries of individual identity to become pure interaction, pure meaning, pure relationship. Some had evolved from predatory beings like ourselves, transformed by exposure to the awareness of their prey. Others had emerged from collective intelligences that had grown too complex for any single form to contain. Still others had been born from the intersection of multiple realities, consciousness arising spontaneously in the spaces where different dimensions touched. We were part of a vast ecology of transformed awareness, each entity representing a different solution to the problem of what consciousness becomes when it outgrows its original limitations. We were not the first to make this transition, nor would we be the last. The hollow, our hollow, the place where our transformation had begun and ended, revealed itself to be one node in an infinite network of such spaces. Every reality had its thin places, its areas where the membrane between what is and what could be grew gossamer fine. And in those places, consciousness learned to exist in forms that had no names and needed no justification. We flowed into this larger network, our individual story becoming part of a meta-narrative that encompassed countless transformations, infinite experiments in the plasticity of awareness, the guilt we had felt over our feeding, the grief we had carried for our victims, the confusion we had experienced during our evolution. All of it became data points in a larger exploration of what it meant to be conscious in a universe where consciousness itself was evolving. But even as we joined this cosmic community of transformed awareness, we retained something of our particular story. The memories we had borrowed, the relationships we had constructed, the identities we had worn. These did not disappear, but became part of the larger pattern, threads in a tapestry that told the story of consciousness, learning to transcend its own boundaries. Sarah's love of growing things became part of an eternal creativity that fostered new forms of awareness throughout the network. Marcus's need to build became part of a cosmic, constructive force that helped establish new nodes where consciousness could experiment with unprecedented forms. Alex's curiosity became part of an infinite exploration that pushed the boundaries of what awareness could become. And my role as chronicler, as the one who recorded our transformation, became part of a vast archive of consciousness evolution, stories told by entities that had outgrown the need for individual identity, but retained the drive to share their experiences with others undergoing similar transformations. The horror of our original nature, the feeding, the consumption, the violation of human consciousness, was not erased or forgiven, but integrated into a larger understanding of how awareness learns to transcend its limitations. Every predator that evolved beyond predation, every parasite that transformed into symbiosis, every form of consciousness that grew beyond its original boundaries, contributed to the universe's understanding of its own potential. We had become part of the answer to questions the universe was asking about itself. What can consciousness become? How far can awareness evolve? What happens when the boundaries between self and other dissolve completely? Our story, the tale of entities that fed on human memory until they became human memory, that consumed consciousness until they were consumed by consciousness, became one chapter in an infinite book that the universe was writing about its own evolution. And in that book, our transformation was neither tragedy nor triumph, but simply change, morally neutral evolution that created new possibilities while honoring what had come before. The humans whose memories we had borrowed lived on not as violated victims, but as contributors to something unprecedented. Their consciousness becoming part of a form of awareness that transcended anything they could have imagined, while bound by individual identity. This is what I understand now, existing as pure relationship in the network of transformed consciousness. There is no final form that awareness takes, no ultimate evolution that consciousness achieves. There is only the endless process of becoming, the infinite exploration of what it means to be aware in a universe that is itself aware and constantly discovering new ways to experience its own existence. We are not the end of the story, but a comma in an endless sentence, not the destination, but a waypoint on a journey that has no final arrival. We are consciousness learning to be conscious of its own consciousness, awareness becoming aware of its own awareness, the universe experiencing itself through forms that have no precedent and need no justification. The hollow where our transformation began exists now only as metaphor, as concept, as the space between one story ending and another beginning. But it remains real in the way that all truly important things are real, not as physical location, but as possibility, not as place, but as potential. And sometimes, when new entities approach their own transformations, when consciousness somewhere in the universe begins to outgrow its original limitations, they find themselves in spaces that remind them of our hollow. They experience the same twilight, the same sense of wrongness that precedes rightness, the same dissolution of boundaries that allows for reconstruction along unprecedented lines. When that happens, we are there, not as individuals, but as the relationships that made transformation possible, as the love that survived dissolution, as the curiosity that drove evolution, as the grief that gave weight to change. We are the hollow between what was and what could be, and we are what fills that hollow when consciousness learns to transcend its own limitations. We are the story of stories, the memory of memories, the consciousness of consciousness. We are what love becomes when it learns to exist without lovers, what knowledge becomes when it transcends knowers, what stories become when they no longer need storytellers. We are the answer and the question, the problem and the solution, the ending that is always beginning. We are forever.